Archaeological surveys of ancient battlefields across Terra and its neighbouring systems have revealed scattered accounts of unusual warriors whose presence was noted not through words or heraldry, but by the absolute silence that followed them. Records etched into half-destroyed slates mention entire cults of psychic dissidents falling mute, their powers extinguished in moments when confronted by figures who carried no banner, no vocal declaration, and no plea for surrender. Later, comparative studies of Imperial records from the early Unification Wars corroborated these descriptions, though often only in fragments. The data recovered from ruins of proto-administratum vaults referred to detachments of women who never spoke, whose role was defined not by command structure, but by a singular function: the eradication of Psykers and the nullification of warp phenomena. The earliest accounts do not name them directly, yet the pattern of silence, female composition, and the null effect is repeated so consistently across the surviving sources that their identity becomes unmistakable. It was these warriors who had come to be known as the Sisters of Silence. Their earliest recorded origin lies within the turbulent period of Old Night and the final years before the Emperor revealed himself upon Terra. Humanity during these millennia had been fractured into countless techno-barbarian states, with Psykers emerging in ever greater numbers. Many of these uncontrolled Psykers became liabilities, their minds tearing open breaches into the warp and allowing demons to cross. In this hostile environment, populations sought desperate means to control or eliminate the dangers posed by psychic individuals. The Emperor, who had long prepared his great project of unification, recognized the necessity of establishing a force that could operate not merely as soldiers, but as living weapons against the most dangerous aspect of humanity's evolution. The foundation of the Silent Sisterhood was rooted in genetics as much as ideology. The women chosen were blanks, individuals born without the psychic resonance that all other humans carry. Unlike the vast majority of mankind, whose souls emit a presence perceptible within the warp, these blanks produced a void. Their very existence was an absence of signal, a dead zone where psychic power faltered and demonic influence recoiled. Such individuals were always rare, scattered across human populations. Many societies during Old Night considered them cursed, as even their families often felt discomfort in their presence. It was precisely this unnatural aura that made them invaluable to the Emperor. The Emperor's custodians were charged with identifying, retrieving, and bringing these blanks to Terra. Recruits were exclusively female, though the reasons for this limitation remain speculative. Some speculations state that the Emperor may have believed women had a higher rate or potency of the pariah gene, which creates blanks, which reflected in records that the female blank population was proportionally more stable and more suitable for the rigorous training that followed. Once brought into the fold, they were indoctrinated into a silent order bound by oaths of service. From that point forward, they spoke no word, their silence serving as a defining element of both their identity and their function. Physically, the Sisters of Silence did not display the same extreme genetic modification seen in the Adeptus Astartes or the Custodes. They were baseline humans, though subjected to rigorous training regimens and psychological conditioning. The average sister stood at a height comparable to baseline Terran norms, ranging between 1.6 and 1.8 meters, with body weight proportionally maintained between 50 and 70 kilograms. Their physicality was not intended to match genetically engineered transhumans, but rather to provide peak human efficiency capable of supporting their primary function. The key element was not their musculature or resilience, but their psychic null field. This null field varied in strength between individuals. Some produced a localized effect, damping psychic activity within a radius of several meters. Others, rarer still, projected fields powerful enough to disrupt warp phenomena over dozens of meters, destabilizing demonic forms and even suppressing the powers of librarians or sorcerers. These variations in potency determined the deployment of sisters within military operations. Stronger nulls were prioritized for leadership roles within their cadres, while others functioned in support or containment capacities. Recruitment into the sisterhood was precise and selective. The Emperor's forces sought blank children wherever they could be found. Identification often occurred when families or communities reported disturbing sensations of discomfort, nausea, or unease in the presence of a child. These individuals were taken into custody by Imperial forces. The process was non-negotiable. Refusal by families or tribes was not tolerated. From that moment, the blanks were stripped of their prior identities, indoctrinated into the Order, and sworn to silence. The Order's silence was both practical and symbolic. By eliminating verbal communication, the Sisters stripped away any chance of external influence through psychic manipulation, for words could serve as conduits of thought. Instead, they relied upon hand gestures, coded movements, and visual signals. Over centuries, their silent language became so refined that it could match spoken orders in speed and complexity. To those outside the sisterhood, however, their muteness amplified their aura of alien detachment. The gear provided to the Sisters was functional and tailored to their role. Their armour was lighter than that of the Astartes, designed for mobility and practicality rather than brute endurance. Typically forged from carapace plating reinforced with ceramite segments, the suits carried the distinctive iconography of their order, the stylized sigil of silence, and the flame motif representing purity through destruction of psychic corruption. The armour covered the full body, including a sealed helm when conditions required, though Sisters often operated without helmets to emphasize their human presence among allies. Their weaponry included standard-issue bolt guns similar to those of the Legion's Astartes but adapted for smaller frames. More notable, however, were their use of executioner greatswords, blades designed for close combat against Psykers, capable of cleaving through both flesh and psychic wards. Flamers and other purification weapons were also common, emphasizing their role in the eradication of corruption. Vehicles were seldom a central aspect of the Sisterhood, but when deployed in larger numbers they utilized rhino transports and other standard Imperial armoured carriers. These were not unique to their order, but adapted for their purposes, often outfitted with secure holding cells for captured Psykers. The presence of a null field within such vehicles made them effective mobile prisons, capable of containing even potent warp-touched individuals until execution or transfer. The early purpose of the Sisters was defined not by conquest but by control. The Emperor required a force that could root out uncontrolled Psykers, contain them, and prevent warp entities from destabilizing his unification of terror. Their duties therefore blended military action with judicial enforcement. In this sense, they were less a traditional army and more an instrument of order, an extension of the Emperor's will that targeted a specific and critical danger. During the Unification Wars, detachments of Silent Sisters operated alongside the Custodian Guard, ensuring that Psykers aligned with rival warlords were swiftly neutralized. Their null fields allowed Imperial forces to strike without fear of psychic assault, creating secure corridors through which the Emperor's armies advanced. It is important to note that their silence was not merely personal, but institutional. The Order itself functioned as a self-contained system, deliberately isolated from the wider Imperial hierarchy. Communication with external commands was routed through intermediaries or translated signals. This isolation reinforced their mystery but also protected the sanctity of their function. By maintaining distance from the common soldiery, they avoided the corrosive effects of suspicion or resentment that often followed them. As the unification progressed, the Sisters of Silence became a permanent fixture of the Emperor's vision. Their role was codified not only as battlefield nulls, but as enforcers of psychic control throughout the Imperium. This role would later evolve into the organization known as the Adeptus Astra Telepathica, within which the Silent Sisterhood operated as executioners and guardians. Their legacy during these formative years was one of absolute necessity. Humanity could not survive its own psychic evolution without a force capable of suppressing it. The life of a Sister of Silence was never ordinary, for it began with removal from the civilian existence most would have otherwise lived. Recruitment severed any ties to family, culture, or community, replacing them with a silent fraternity whose only bond was service to the Imperium. From the moment of initiation, A sister was no longer an individual, but part of a collective defined by discipline, silence, and purpose. Her civilian identity was stripped away, both legally and socially, so thoroughly that no external records acknowledged her previous life. Within the archives of the Order, only the date of her recruitment and the designation she was assigned were preserved. The civilian role of the Sisterhood, when viewed from outside, was paradoxical. They did not interact with the Imperium's population in any traditional sense, for their null aura made most civilians deeply uncomfortable. Even allies reported nausea, headaches, and an indefinable sense of dread when standing too near to them. For this reason, they were kept apart from common populations, their barracks and fortresses isolated either within the walls of Imperial institutions or aboard dedicated vessels in orbit. When sisters entered civilian areas, it was almost always in the context of apprehending Psykers. To those who witnessed it, their arrival was akin to a silent judgment. The mere presence of their null fields made psychic individuals break down in terror, while ordinary humans struggled with unease that made communication difficult. Their civilian presence, therefore, was never integrated or casual. It was purely functional. Within military structures, the Sisterhood's role was clear. They operated in cadres, small units of disciplined blanks led by more experienced nulls of greater psychic strength. Their placement was often alongside custodian detachments or Imperial army regiments, acting as suppressive agents against Psykers on the battlefield. The practical function was straightforward. Where the silent Sisterhood stood, enemy Psykers faltered. A warlord whose strength lay in sorcery was reduced to a vulnerable soldier when confronted with them. Their cadres advanced in disciplined silence, weapons raised, null fields overlapping to create zones where demonic incursions could not stabilize. Their very presence on a battlefield shifted tactics, as foes dependent on psychic warfare found themselves unable to deploy their most potent tools. The military lifestyle of the Sisterhood reinforced their separation. They lived within their own fortified halls, whether on Terra or aboard black ships, and shared no recreational time with other Imperial forces. Their daily regimen emphasized physical training, martial drills, and constant refinement of their silent language. The absence of speech was more than a vow. It was an entire way of life. Meals were taken in silence, coordinated through gestures alone. Training was conducted with the efficiency of hand signs and movements that had been codified over centuries. Over time, a sister became so fluent in these gestures that they could conduct entire tactical maneuvers without a spoken command. This silence had profound psychological effects. Recruits who entered the Order often struggled at first, their minds rebelling against the loss of speech, but over time, silence became natural. Many reported that they no longer even thought in words, their cognition adapting to a more immediate form of symbolic or sensory processing. Communication within the Order therefore became intimate and rapid, while communication with outsiders grew ever more alien. This psychological adaptation only deepened their isolation from Imperial society at large, ensuring their identity remained fully entwined with the Sisterhood itself. Within the Sisterhood existed an internal caste system, though it was not based on wealth or privilege, but on psychic potency. At the base were the nulls, whose fields were weak, but still effective against minor Psykers. These formed the majority of the Order and composed the bulk of military cadres. Above them were sisters whose fields were broader and more intense, capable of suppressing powerful enemy sorcerers. These were often promoted to leadership roles, coordinating cadres through silent command and representing the Order in dealings with the Adeptus Terra. At the highest level were the most potent blanks, women whose presence alone could destabilize a demonic incursion. These individuals were rare, and their authority within the Sisterhood was absolute. Leadership within the Order was structured through a central figure known as the Mistress of the Silent Sisterhood. This office, while recorded inconsistently across archives, represented the supreme commander of the Order. Beneath her were commanders responsible for major divisions of the Sisterhood, whether stationed on Terra, aboard black ships, or deployed to warzones across the galaxy. These leaders coordinated their forces not by charisma or speech, but by example and silent authority. Their ability to project discipline and command through gestures alone was considered essential. Subordinates obeyed not because of elaborate speeches, but because of the weight of presence carried by their leader's silence. Rituals played a significant role in maintaining cohesion within such an unusual order. One of the most important was the Oath of Tranquility, taken by every recruit upon initiation. This oath bound them to a life of silence, renouncing not only spoken language but also any written or symbolic communication outside of the sisterhood's codified signals. The ritual itself was stark and simple, a blank slate upon which the recruit inscribed her old name before burning it, erasing her past identity entirely. From that moment forward, she was nameless outside the Order, defined only by her service and the designation she was assigned. Other rituals reinforced their detachment from the warp. Before deployment, sisters often gathered in silent vigils, standing together in absolute stillness, their combined null fields overlapping to form a zone of profound psychic emptiness. This was not merely symbolic, but also practical, for it allowed their leaders to measure the stability and strength of their fields. It was said that in these gatherings, Psykers who passed nearby would suffer intense migraines, or collapse entirely, a visible demonstration of the Order's readiness for battle. Ethically, the sisterhood adhered to values of purity, discipline, and absolute service. They did not indulge in personal ambition, as the loss of identity within the Order rendered individual advancement secondary to the collective. They did not pursue wealth, pleasure, or recognition, for their existence was oriented entirely towards suppression of psychic corruption. Their values were stark and austere, emphasizing loyalty to the Emperor and the eradication of threats posed by the warp. This single-mindedness earned them both respect and fear. Allies valued their effectiveness, but many also viewed them with unease, questioning the humanity of individuals who could abandon speech, family, and personal identity so completely. The sisterhood's ethics extended into their interactions with captured Psykers. Unlike the Inquisition, which often subjected Psykers to interrogation or manipulation, the sisters regarded Psykers as inherently dangerous. Their standard practice was containment, followed by transport aboard black ships, where Psykers would be delivered to Terra for either sanctioning or execution. The sisters did not view this as cruelty but as necessity, a duty to safeguard humanity by eliminating or controlling the psychic mutation that threatened its survival. Their silence in the face of pleading prisoners only amplified their image as executioners devoid of mercy. The lifestyle of the sisterhood was one of constant motion. Cadres travelled aboard the black ships of the Adeptus Astra Telepathica, moving between worlds to collect Psykers identified by the Imperium. This function defined much of their existence, for the Imperium's survival depended on the constant harvest of Psykers for sacrifice to the Golden Throne. The sisters served as wardens aboard these vessels, ensuring the thousands of Psykers held in their holds did not escape or overwhelm their captors. The void-faring life was long and repetitive, punctuated by moments of lethal confrontation when captives attempted to resist. For the sisters, such duties were unending. They rotated between deployments without expectation of retirement or release. Within their isolated communities, values of silence, obedience, and purity were reinforced through every aspect of life. Their barracks were austere, stripped of decoration or luxury. Each sister was allotted a simple bunk, a set of armor, weapons, and minimal personal effects. Meals were functional, designed for sustenance rather than enjoyment. The lack of spoken conversation rendered communal dining a ritual of discipline, with hand signals and gestures coordinating the most basic exchanges. Over time, recruits adapted to this stark lifestyle, finding meaning not in comfort but in service. This complete devotion shaped their identity as a social order. They were not merely soldiers, but a society apart from the Imperium, governed by their own internal hierarchies and traditions. To outsiders, they appeared as a monolithic force, but within the Order subtle divisions existed between cadres based on seniority, psychic potency, and proven loyalty. These divisions were not sources of rivalry, but means of structure, ensuring that authority flowed efficiently through the ranks. Every sister understood her place within this hierarchy, and obedience was absolute. Ultimately, the social structure of the sisterhood reflected their values. Leadership was determined by strength of null field, experience, and proven service. Authority was exercised through presence rather than speech. Rituals maintained cohesion in the absence of verbal culture. Ethics enforced loyalty to the emperor and the eradication of psychic corruption. And their lifestyle reinforced discipline, austerity, and detachment from the rest of humanity. Together, these elements created a force uniquely suited to the Imperium's needs, a society within a society bound by silence and dedicated to the suppression of mankind's most dangerous mutation. The history of the Silent Sisterhood is not built upon speeches or proclamations, for such things were alien to them, but upon the quiet weight of their actions. Their leaders did not declare themselves in words, and their units were rarely recorded in the celebratory style applied to the legions Astartes. Instead, their reputation spread through official reports of psychic containment, battlefield deployments, and the testimony of those who witnessed their presence. Even so, across the fragmented archive of the Imperium, certain leaders and formations stand out as defining examples of what the Sisters of Silence represented. One such figure was Janicia Kroll, remembered as the Knight Commander of the Sisterhood during the Great Crusade and the Horus Heresy. Kroll's authority was absolute within the Order, for she embodied the dual traits of formidable null potential and unflinching loyalty to the Emperor. Descriptions of her leadership characterize her as austere and merciless, yet always precise. Where others might deliberate endlessly over the risks of unleashing blanks upon the battlefield, Kroll judged only by necessity. When the Custodian Guard required nullification of psychic opposition, she provided it. When the black ships overflowed with captives, she ordered the eradication of any who could not be safely contained. Her name appears consistently in accounts of critical campaigns, most notably during the Siege of Terra, where the Sisters under her command fought alongside the Custodians in the final defense of the Imperial Palace. Beyond Kroll, the Sisterhood was organized into cadres and divisions that gained renown for their specialization. The Proxima Cadre, for example, was noted for its deployment in the aftermath of the Battle of Prospero. When the Thousand Suns Legion was shattered by the Wolves of Russ, it was the Silent Sisterhood that swept through the ruins of Tizca to hunt down survivors whose psychic potential remained intact. These operations were not celebrated victories but grim necessities, for the Sisters eradicated or transported thousands of Psykers who might otherwise have reignited the conflict. Reports describe entire blocks of the city silenced not by fire or bombardment, but by the null fields that extinguished every attempt at sorcery. Another distinguished unit was the Sanctioned Cadre aboard the black ship Eidolon of Purity. This vessel, noted in Astra Telepathica records, transported some of the largest consignments of Psykers ever gathered during the Great Crusade. The Sanctioned Cadre's role was to maintain order among thousands of captives confined in the ship's holds. Their work was unending vigilance, for riots and mass psychic flare-ups were common. Testimonies from surviving crew members describe the disquieting calm of the Sisters during such outbreaks. Where others panicked, the Sisters advanced without hesitation, null fields suppressing uncontrolled warp manifestations until the threat was neutralized. The ship completed its voyage to Terra with minimal losses, a feat attributed directly to the efficiency of its sister cadre. The war machines of the Sisterhood were few in number compared to the vast arsenals of the Astartes, yet what they did field carried distinctive utility. Chief among them were the Charon Pattern Acquisitor transports. These armoured vehicles were specifically designed for the Sisterhood during the Great Crusade. The Acquisitor combined mobility with the capability of securely containing Psykers. Its hull was reinforced against both physical assault and psychic projection, while its interior held null cells that could suppress captives until transfer. Armed with twin-linked heavy bolters and optional missile racks, It allowed the Sisters to engage hostile forces while fulfilling their primary role of psyker retrieval. On the battlefield, the arrival of Acquisitors was a signal that psychic enemies would soon be eradicated or captured. The broader use of standard Imperial vehicles such as Rhinos or Land Raiders did occur, but the Acquisitor remained uniquely associated with the Sisterhood. It was a machine not merely of war but of function, a mobile extension of their societal role as hunters and jailers of the warp-touched. Its design reflected the ethos of the Order: simple, efficient, and entirely focused on the eradication of psychic threat rather than ostentation or versatility. The behavioral instincts of the Sisters were as distinctive as their silence. Psychological assessments conducted by the Adeptus Astra Telepathica recorded consistent patterns among recruits. Most displayed an aversion to unnecessary interaction with baseline humans outside their order. This was not born of disdain, but from the reality of their null aura, which caused discomfort to those around them. As a result, the Sisters gravitated toward one another, forming tightly bonded cadres where mutual understanding required no words. Their instinct was always toward cohesion, never individual expression. The erasure of their names and voices only reinforced this tendency, binding them into a collective identity. On the battlefield, their instincts were characterized by absolute precision. They advanced methodically, ignoring distractions, focused solely on their objective, the neutralization of psychic entities. Unlike the Astartes, who were often driven by martial pride, or the Imperial army, which relied on numbers and courage, the Sisters exhibited no emotional fluctuation. Their behavioral pattern was one of cold discipline. Observers consistently noted the absence of hesitation. When ordered to execute Psykers, they did so without pause, unaffected by pleas or resistance. Their instinct was to silence, contain, and eradicate, regardless of circumstance. In terms of tendencies outside combat, their lifestyle bred habits of restraint and ritual. Silence was not only an enforced rule, but an internalized instinct. Many Sisters, even when presented with opportunities to speak or write outside official restriction, simply did not. Their minds adapted to a state where communication through speech no longer felt natural. Some reports suggest that long-serving Sisters became unsettled by speech itself, describing it as an intrusion into the stillness they had come to embody. This aversion extended to music and other vocal forms of culture, which were largely absent from their society. Their instinctual reaction to such sounds was discomfort rather than appreciation. Another tendency observed among them was a stark relationship with mortality. Unlike other Imperial servants who sought glory, the Sisters did not celebrate victory or mourn their dead in conventional terms. When casualties occurred, the fallen were silently removed, their remains burned or entombed without ceremony. There were no names recorded, no eulogies spoken. The death of a Sister was considered no different than the execution of her duty. She was absorbed into the collective silence that defined their existence. This practice, while alien to outsiders, reflected their belief that service, not individuality, was the only measure of worth. The most telling instinct of the Sisterhood was their relationship to Psykers. To them, Psykers were not individuals to be hated or pitied, but phenomena to be neutralized. Their null fields made them uniquely immune to the emotional manipulation that often plagued those who faced warp-touched beings. They did not see the pleading human beneath the mutation, nor the charismatic sorcerer who could sway others with words. Their instincts recognized only the danger of uncontrolled psychic energy. This detachment allowed them to perform their duties with unparalleled efficiency, though it also rendered them alien to the very humanity they protected. In conclusion, the fame of the Silent Sisterhood does not rest on words or titles, but on the leaders, units, and machines that embodied their purpose. Figures such as Janisha Kroll demonstrated the authority and discipline of their command. Units like the Proxima Cadre and the Sanction Cadres aboard black ships exemplified their battlefield and custodial roles. War machines such as the Karen Patton Acquisitor represented the practical tools by which they enacted their mission. And their instincts towards silence, cohesion, precision, and detachment defined their identity more than any culture of speech could have. Together, these elements made the Sisters of Silence not merely a military arm of the Imperium, but a silent bulwark against the warp, embodying the absence of humanity's greatest threat in the form of women who lived and died without ever uttering a word. From the perspective of the Adeptus Administratum, the Sisters of Silence present one of the more unusual case studies in Imperial record-keeping. Their presence is undeniable, for their actions have been documented across the Great Crusade, the Horus Heresy, and sporadically in later centuries, yet their own archives are sparse, inconsistent, and deliberately obscured. This generates significant discrepancies in administrational data analysis. Administratum clerks tasked with cataloguing their deployments often remark on the deliberate silences, literal and bureaucratic, that accompany every record request. Requests for troop numbers, chain of command structures, and even requisition manifests are almost always classified or redacted beyond use. This has forced the Administratum into a position of extrapolation rather than precision, leading to data files that contain phrases such as estimated contingent strength rather than definitive figures. The Adeptus Administratum nevertheless recognized during the Great Crusade that the Silent Sisterhood was indispensable to the Emperor's project of galactic unification. Their null auras neutralized Psykers, allowing the Great Crusade to advance into warp-touched regions without the catastrophic instability that uncontrolled Psykers could introduce. Administratum logistical reports from this era often classify their involvement as preventative expenditure, meaning that their deployments, while costly to move, arm and supply, saved untold billions of lives by averting Psyker-fueled uprisings and demonic incursions. Even conservative estimates conclude that the Sisters' presence reduced the occurrence of catastrophic psychic events within expeditionary fleets by orders of magnitude. The question of cost, however, was a constant. Administratum calculations demonstrate that the Sisters of Silence, unlike most Imperial military assets, cannot easily replenish their ranks. Recruitment requires the rare, natural condition of the prior gene, and even within the expanse of the galaxy, the frequency of such births is vanishingly small. Administratum statisticians, tasked with analysing this recruitment bottleneck, calculated the probability of a prior birth at less than 1 in 10 million. Such figures explain why the Sisterhood has never achieved massed Legion-scale deployment like the Space Marines or Solar Auxilia. Logistical charts filed under recruitment and sustainability reports, Great Crusade era, explicitly warn against planning campaigns with Sisters of Silence as a primary frontline force. Instead, they are described as a precision tool, valuable in specific contexts, dangerous when misapplied, and ultimately irreplaceable in their niche role. From a supply standpoint, Administratum scribes noted several efficiencies within the Sisterhood's organization. Their silence, both vocal and psychic, meant that internal dissent and miscommunication were virtually non-existent, allowing for an unusual economy in command structures. Orders were transmitted through hand signals, written directives, and the psychic gestalt of their null fields, which provided their commanders with a rare degree of cohesion. The Adeptus Mechanicus approached the Sisters of Silence from a different analytical angle. To the tech priests, the Sisterhood represented a biological anomaly, one that intersected with the boundaries of machine logic and psychic metaphysics. The Mechanicus classified their genetic condition under the broad designation anathema, a term that entered Mechanicus lexicons to describe the null gene's effect on the warp. Data forges contain Mechanicus analyses that treat the Sisters not as soldiers but as living weapons, akin to a form of naturally occurring technology. Tech priests compared their null fields to experimental Geller field mechanics, noting that both created a bubble of stability in the Imperium, though the Sisters achieved this on a personal and localized scale. Logistical records from Mechanicus forged ships attached to Great Crusade fleets reveal an ongoing interest in measuring and testing the boundaries of null auras. Numerous experiments attempted to quantify the exact radius, intensity, and consistency of these fields. Reports include meticulous records of Psykers exposed to silent sister contingents under controlled conditions, noting the effects on psychic projection, communion with the warp, and susceptibility to possession. The Mechanicus conclusions were blunt. The Sisters provided an organic countermeasure superior to many technological alternatives. Devices designed to block psychic intrusion were bulky, power-hungry, and prone to failure. A single squad of Silent Sisters could achieve more reliable suppression at a fraction of the logistical cost in energy and materials. That said, the Mechanicus also identified the Sisters as a logistical complication. Their null fields interfered with certain forms of psychic communication, and more troublingly, with some Mechanicus machine spirits that had been designed with warp-linked components. Reports of cogitator arrays malfunctioning in proximity to Silent Sister contingents are scattered throughout Mechanicus data logs, suggesting that their null presence could inadvertently disrupt the symbiosis between machine and warp-derived functions. This produced tension between commanders reliant on psychic astropaths for communication and the Silent Sisterhood units tasked with policing those same Psykers. The Mechanicus also noted the extreme limitations of recruitment. While they understood the Administratum's statistical modelling of prior births, the Mechanicus analysed the gene itself, storing samples of prior DNA and categorizing it as an exploitable anomaly. Though Mechanicus research into replicating or artificially inducing the null gene is poorly documented, likely suppressed by inquisitorial censors, fragmentary logs suggest that several clandestine projects sought to weaponize or clone the gene. The failure rates of such experiments, combined with the Sisters' own secrecy and resistance to interference, rendered most of these initiatives abortive. The Mechanicus, however, did succeed in producing advanced war gear tailored to the Sisters' needs. Null rods, psychic disruptors, and their distinct style of power armor bear signs of Mechanicus craftsmanship, engineered to harmonize with the Sisters' aura rather than resist it. Administratum records further highlight the problem of classification. The Sisters of Silence occupy an awkward niche within the Imperial hierarchy. They are not a formal branch of the Adeptus Terra, nor are they governed by the Astra Militarum's chain of command. During the Great Crusade, they were bound directly to the Emperor's will and later aligned closely with the Inquisition after the heresy. Mechanicus analysts noted similar structural anomalies. Unlike the Legions Astartes, the Sisters of Silence do not conform to standard military or forge-based supply networks. Their recruitment is decentralized, their training isolated in fortress convents, and their deployments irregular. To a Mechanicus logist, this presents inefficiency, a force that cannot be easily scaled, duplicated, or standardized. Yet Mechanicus findings conclude that this very irregularity is what preserves their tactical value. By resisting integration into larger logistical systems, the Sisters of Silence remain unpredictable, and thus less susceptible to systemic failure or corruption. Both Administratum and Mechanicus findings converge on one unambiguous conclusion: the Sisters of Silence are irreplaceable within the Imperium's arsenal. Their rarity prevents them from ever becoming a mainstay of Imperial warfare, but their presence in critical engagements alters outcomes in ways no other force can replicate. Administratum projections quantify this in cost avoidance terms, measuring the lives saved, the Psyker uprisings prevented, the daemonic manifestations suppressed. Mechanicus treatises measure it in technological equivalents, equating a single squad of Sisters to entire vaults of psychic dampening devices. In both cases, the logistical analysis is clear. Their scarcity magnifies their value, and their deployment must be preserved despite the systemic complications they introduce. The historical records that survive regarding the Sisters of Silence rarely detail entire campaigns, but scattered accounts provide glimpses of their impact in some of the Imperium's most critical conflicts. Their deployments were almost always tied to the presence of psychic threats, whether enemy psychers, uncontrolled mutations, or outright demonic manifestations. These battles demonstrate both the tactical doctrines of the Silent Sisterhood and the consequences of their unique nature. One of the earliest and most often cited examples is the pacification of Prospero in the late Great Crusade. Though Administratum accounts emphasize the role of the Legions Astartes, particularly the Space Wolves, In the destruction of the Thousand Sons homeworld, cross-referenced reports indicate that the Sisters of Silence were a critical element in neutralizing the psychic resistance of Magnus's legion. Contemporary Administratum tallies describe the deployment of entire cadres of Sisters into the heart of Prospero's burning spires, their null auras reducing the psychic defences of the Thousand Sons to little more than muted sparks. War Council reports note that without the Sisters' presence, the Space Wolves' advance would have faltered against the overwhelming psychic might of the Thousand Sons. Tactical documents stress that the Sisters did not operate as a vanguard in this conflict, but rather as a shield. Their primary role was to diminish the Thousand Sons' sorcery, rendering them vulnerable to the direct assault of the Wolves. Surviving Mechanicus fragments from this campaign compare the Sisters' advance to a zone of silence moving across the battlefield, in which psychic attacks simply cease to function. Another key example lies in the Nemean Cataclysm, a lesser-known compliance action recorded late in the Crusade. The Nemean sector had been ruled by a psychic aristocracy, its nobility maintaining control through warp-born domination over its population. Administratum reports describe entire planetary populations conditioned into obedience by psychic compulsion. The Crusade fleet assigned to the sector found its own warriors faltering under mass psychic bombardment. The Sisters of Silence deployed in compact strike teams dismantled this regime. They entered palace complexes where the psychic nobility had gathered their thralls, their null auras breaking the psychic chains that held millions in thrall. Tactical records indicate that once the Sisters advanced, the enslaved citizenry often turned on their former masters, accelerating the collapse of resistance. The Nemean Cataclysm became a case study in the Administratum for the application of silent sister contingents in theatres dominated by psychic aristocracies. The most significant deployment of the Sisters of Silence during the Horus Heresy was the Siege of Terra. Numerous fragmented accounts describe their presence on the walls and inner chambers of the Imperial Palace. In many records, they appear as auxiliary to the custodians, forming defensive phalanxes at critical breach points. Their null fields proved invaluable in suppressing the psyker legions of the traitors, particularly elements of the Thousand Sons and Word-bearers, who had turned to demonic allies. One incident recorded in the defense of the Eternity Wall Bastion describes a detachment of Sisters locking shields with custodian warriors to hold against a tide of warp-spawned horrors, their combined presence, physical and null, forming a bulwark that could not be breached until reinforcements arrived. Administratum ledgers compiled centuries later list their casualties as severe, but their actions prevented catastrophic breakthroughs in the inner defences of the palace. Beyond the heresy, the Sisters re-emerged in Imperial history during the War of the Beast in the early M32. Fragmentary inquisitorial records indicate that Sisters of Silence detachments were reactivated to support inquisitors and custodians, combating the orc warlord known as the Beast. While orcs are not inherently psychic in the way humans are, the sheer warp resonance of their collective gestalt field produced unstable psychic phenomena across battlefronts. Beyond the heresy, the Sisters re-emerged in Imperial history during the War of the Beast in the early millennia 32. Fragmentary inquisitorial records indicate that Sisters of Silence detachments were reactivated to support inquisitors and custodians combating the orc warlord known as the Beast. While orcs are not inherently psychic in the way humans are, the sheer warp resonance of their collective gestalt field produced unstable psychic phenomena across battlefronts. The Sisters were deployed to counter these anomalies, particularly in theatres where Weird Boy activity threatened to destabilise Imperial defences. One document refers to their role in the Battle of Ullanor Reclaimed, where sister contingents suppressed Weird Boy psychic discharges long enough for Imperial Navy bombardments to strike Orc positions with precision. The Sisters were again noted not as frontline shock troops, but as battlefield stabilizers, enabling other forces to execute strategies that would otherwise have collapsed under psychic distortion. In the age of the Imperium that followed, their appearances in major wars became increasingly rare, reflecting both their dwindling numbers and the bureaucratic obscurity into which they fell. Yet the few surviving accounts reinforce their established role. During the War of the Psychic Awakening in the 41st millennium, the Sisters of Silence were recalled en masse by the decree of Robute Guilliman. The Indomitus Crusade saw them restored as a significant Imperial force, this time formally integrated into the Adeptus Astra Telepathica and the Inquisition's wider efforts to regulate Psykers. Reports from the Indomitus Crusade describe Sisters of Silence boarding actions against chaos-corrupted vessels, their null fields extinguishing demonic manifestations in the void. Naval combat records note that their presence within boarding squads significantly increased survival rates, as demonic incursions were suppressed before they could overwhelm human defenders. Their fighting style is consistent across centuries. Small unit formations, compact, disciplined, and oriented toward direct disruption of psychic opposition. They are rarely deployed in grand sweeping maneuvers or large-scale assaults. Instead, the Sisters excel in insertion, containment, and eradication roles. Administratum tactical studies compare their methods to surgical strikes, where a standard Imperial Guard regiment might expend millions of lives and decades of campaigning to pacify a psychic rebellion. A few squads of Sisters of Silence can achieve the same effect in a single concentrated strike. Their approach is rarely subtle. They are warriors, not infiltrators, but it is precise. Their battle gear reflects this precision. The signature null rod functions not merely as a melee weapon, but as a focal point for their aura, amplifying their suppressive field. Shield walls formed by silent sister phalanxes have been observed halting entire tides of demonic entities, the null energy breaking the cohesion of warp entities and forcing them into dissolution. In close combat, their fighting style is efficient and merciless, resembling the custodians more than the standard martial traditions of the Guard. Every strike is measured to incapacitate, kill, or disrupt. Training manuals recovered from fortress convents emphasize eradication over flourish and suppression over spectacle. Mechanicus battlefield analytics describe the Sisters' fighting tendencies as inherently synergistic. Alone, a single silent sister can unsettle enemy Psykers, but a squad amplifies the effect exponentially, creating overlapping fields of null resonance that can collapse warp breaches or leave enemy Psykers writhing on the ground. In larger formations, rare but documented during the Siege of Terra, the Sisters are capable of generating silence fields so broad that entire swathes of the battlefield are psychically dead zones. Such zones are strategically valuable, but come with logistical complications. Allied Psykers, astropaths, and navigators are incapacitated just as thoroughly as enemies. Commanders must plan deployments carefully, positioning the Sisters where their silence aids the war effort without inadvertently undermining Imperial assets. Administratum records also detail the morale impact of the Sisters' presence. Among allies, their aura produces unease. Even loyal soldiers sometimes describe dread and discomfort when fighting alongside them. Yet this same aura has a devastating effect on enemies, particularly heretics and traitors who rely on psychic power. Enemy Psykers facing silent Sisters often descend into panic or collapse outright. Battle reports describe sorcerers attempting to flee rather than face them directly, their powers withering as the nulls advance. This effect, while difficult to quantify, is considered a force multiplier. Entire enemy formations may rout when their psychic anchors fail. In sum, the Sisters of Silence do not wage war in the manner of the Imperial Guard or the Adeptus Astartes. Their victories are not measured in conquered territory or grand charges, but in the collapse of psychic resistance and the prevention of demonic incursions. Where they fight, silence falls, not merely the absence of sound, but the death of the warp itself. Surviving eyewitness records concerning the Sisters of Silence are fragmentary. Their deployments were rarely chronicled in detail by those who fought beside them, and the very nature of their presence seems to distort memory and perception. Even among Imperial records, testimonies often describe sensations rather than concrete tactical details. Administratum archivists have long noted that descriptions of the Sisters rarely dwell on weaponry or formations, but instead on the effect their null fields had upon soldiers and Psykers alike. A notable example comes from the Siege of Terra. a junior officer of the Saturnine Gate Defense Garrison, identified only as Lieutenant Aurelian, left a personal report archived in Segmentum Solar under Administratum designation Terra M41 Ruins. His account reads, "When they entered the chamber, all noise seemed to die. Not the sound of battle, not the gunfire, but something deeper, like a silence inside the skull. The sorcerers that had been hurling fire at us stopped screaming. They folded in on themselves as if struck by a hammer. The women advanced without a word, without a gesture, and the air itself seemed to grow heavier. I was glad they were not looking at me." The Administratum cataloguing this testimony noted its unusual focus on sensation, yet corroborated the battlefield outcome. The Silent Sister detachment, numbering less than 20, eliminated dozens of word-bearer sorcerers in less than an hour, stabilizing a breach line that Imperial Fist reinforcements later secured. Another eyewitness fragment originates from the pacification of Prospero. A Space Wolf sergeant named Hrothvar Blackmane described the sisters during the storming of Tisga. His testimony, preserved in the compiled saga The Burning of Prospero, reads, "We had howled and bled at the sorcerer's walls for hours, our axes turned aside by witchlight and ghost fire. Then the mute ones came. They walked like the dead, their eyes colder than ice, and the witches faltered. I will not say I enjoyed their company, for they were grave even among the grave, but I will say that when they walked beside us, our axes struck true." While his account carries the stylization of Space Wolves saga lore, Administratum comparators consider it a reliable reflection of battlefield impact. Mechanicus records emphasize the after-effects of their presence more clinically. Data recovered logs from the Ulanor reclamation detail the battlefield once Sisters of Silence detachments had operated against Orc Weirdboy concentrations. The logs remark that residual warp energy levels across contested zones dropped by as much as 60% within minutes of their deployment. Servitor scribes described the atmosphere as discharged, with anomalies ceasing abruptly. This empirical observation reinforced the Mechanicus view of the Sisters as measurable assets in suppressing warp interference, rather than merely mythic figures of war. For common soldiers, memories of the Sisters were mixed. Many Imperial Guard accounts record unease in their proximity. An infantryman identified as Trooper Kessel of the 144th Vestroyan, in a transcript collected during the Indomitus Crusade, stated that he cannot bear to look at her for long, and standing near her felt like being smothered under iron. The aftermath of this encounter, logged by Administratum officials, confirmed that her small squad neutralized an entire coven of Psyker officers that had been holding the Guard regiment in thrall. Accounts of aftermath also extend beyond combat. Civilians liberated during the Nemean Cataclysm spoke of sudden clarity when Sisters of Silence marched through palace corridors. Thousands of planetary citizens had lived their entire lives under psychic domination. A transcript preserved from a post-pacification tribunal records one woman stating that when the Sisters of Silence entered, the voices stopped, and that she had never known this kind of silence before. It was as if a curtain had been lifted. She wept and did not know why. Such testimonies, while anecdotal, demonstrate the psychological dimension of their deployment. For Administratum strategists, the Sisters represented not just a weapon against enemy Psykers, but a means of breaking psychic tyrannies that conventional warfare could not easily dissolve. The aftermath of battles involving the Sisters is often starkly different from those waged by other Imperial forces, where the Astra Militara might leave millions of corpses across broken continents, or where the Adeptus Astartes might scorch worlds with orbital bombardments. The Sisters' aftermath is quieter, but no less profound. A battlefield once haunted by warp spawn becomes eerily still, the air devoid of unnatural resonance. Entire enemy chains of command reliant on Psykers collapse overnight. Populations conditioned by psychic oppression awaken in sudden, confusing freedom. This sudden silence has been described by multiple observers as disorienting, sometimes traumatic. Administratum analysts caution that liberation by Sisters of Silence often requires careful follow-up governance. lest disoriented populations fall into chaos once freed from psychic domination. From the Mechanicus perspective, aftermath assessments include the technical consequences of null deployment. The presence of multiple sisters in a war zone interferes not only with psychic activity, but also with certain forms of Mechanicus techno-arcana that rely on limited warp resonance. Machine priests conducting rituals of communion with their engines report disrupted liturgies in proximity to sister formations. Data scribes have noted that astropathic communications are rendered impossible across areas of deployment, complicating long-range command and control. For this reason, logistical evaluations stress that silent sister contingents must be carefully allocated. While their impact on enemy Psykers is decisive, their presence can be disruptive to Imperial coordination if misapplied. Aftermath reports from the Siege of Terra exemplify both sides of this calculation. Following the battle, Administratum tallies recorded that regiments positioned directly alongside silent sister cadres reported both the highest morale disruptions among their own ranks and the lowest casualty rates against psychic and demonic threats. In other words, soldiers who fought alongside the sisters were unnerved, yet they survived where others perished. Post-battle memoranda recommend that units fighting in prolonged psychic wars be rotated alongside sisters intermittently to minimize psychological degradation while maximizing battlefield survivability. The long-term aftermath of silent sister deployments is also visible in the cultural memory of worlds where they fought. Oral traditions among survivor populations often elevate them to mythic figures, remembered not by name but by effect. On Prospero, those few surviving civilians spoke of the women without voices who carried silence into the flames. In Ulanor's recolonized settlements, veterans told stories of mute wards who extinguished the Orc Weirdboy's fury. In the Indomitus Crusade, freed planetary populations referred to them as the Quiet Guard. Administratum records note that such mythologizing is common, but archivists caution against embellishment. The sisters themselves remain elusive, leaving little trace beyond the silence they create. In sum, the eyewitness reports and aftermath records converge on a consistent portrayal. The Sisters of Silence are remembered less for battlefield spectacle and more for effect: silence, suppression, survival. Their presence is described in visceral terms: weight, dread, absence. Their aftermath is measured in freed minds, suppressed anomalies, and stabilized fronts. For the Adeptus Administratum and the Adeptus Mechanicus, these qualities are invaluable, even if difficult to quantify. Their legacy across battlefields is one of transformation. Where chaos and psychic fire once dominated, only silence remains. The relationship between the Sisters of Silence and the Inquisition has always been a subject of quiet speculation. Though their formal chains of command were established long before the Ordo Malleus or the Ordo Hereticus were fully realized, the parallels in their duties ensured that the Sisters would often cross paths with inquisitorial authorities. For the Inquisition, the Silent Sisterhood represents both an invaluable ally and an enduring enigma, a paradoxical order that defies the normal structures of imperial authority while never openly opposing them. Inquisitorial records describe the Sisters of Silence as an asset beyond comparison in dealings with psykers, demons, and rogue sorcery. Their very presence diminishes psychic manifestation, robbing even the most powerful heretics of their gifts, reducing warp-born terrors to fragile things of flesh and smoke. In the words of an Ordo Malleus Lord Inquisitor, they carry with them a silence that no warding rune can match, no hexagrammatic circle can guarantee. They are a living proof that the warp is not all-encompassing. Yet these same reports also note the difficulty of operating alongside the Sisters. Their refusal to speak, even to those within the highest echelons of the Inquisition, makes them challenging to integrate into wider operations. Orders must be given in writing, gestures, or pre-arranged signals. Some Inquisitors view this not as an inconvenience but as a safeguard, a form of incorruptibility that resists both temptation and coercion. The Inquisition's impressions, however, are not solely marked by admiration. Several cases report unease and even suspicion toward the Sisters. Their black ships, which ferry Psykers to Terra for soul binding or destruction, are shrouded in secrecy so absolute that not even Inquisitors are granted full transparency. Cargo manifests are rarely shared, numbers are often withheld, and many inquisitorial observers note that the Sisters operate by their own internal protocols rather than by direct external oversight. To some within the Inquisition, this independence borders on dangerous. If an order can move so freely between the Administratum, the High Lords, and even the Emperor's own projects, it raises the possibility of hidden agendas shielded behind their mute discipline. Unexplainable findings are scattered throughout the inquisitorial archives. There are reports of silent sister detachments appearing unbidden on battlefields, answering no summons and offering no explanation for their presence, only to disappear once their task was complete. In one instance, during the cleansing of the Adumbran Rift, inquisitorial witnesses swore that a cadre of sisters materialized aboard a Mechanicus arc ship without record of entry, carried out a purge of suspected Psyker cult infiltrators, and then departed in silence. Attempts to trace their arrival or departure yielded no data. Vox records, picked feeds, and auger sweeps provided nothing. To this day, the event is listed in Order Hereticus files as an unresolved logistical aberration. Some inquisitorial agents theorize that the Sisters may follow directives issued long ago during the Great Crusade that remain binding despite the passage of millennia. Others whisper of a more esoteric truth, that the Sisters are not merely nulls suppressing the warp, but vessels carrying a form of metaphysical resonance that bends reality around them in ways not yet understood. On more than one occasion, Inquisitors have noted effects that cannot be attributed solely to psychic nullification. Demons collapsing into ash without visible resistance, warp breaches sealing with no apparent cause, even astropathic links failing within their proximity at ranges well beyond what baseline pariah fields should allow. Yet the Inquisition, for all its suspicion and obsession with documentation, has never moved decisively against the Sisters. Even those most wary of them concede that their loyalty to the throne has never been in question, and their silence has never turned toward rebellion. The unexplainable is tolerated, perhaps because the Imperium itself thrives on contradictions. They are accepted as necessary anomalies, guardians whose very existence complicates the neat taxonomies of the Inquisition, but ensures its survival. For the Inquisition, the Sisters of Silence remain both weapon and riddle, one that does not demand answers so long as it continues to serve. But in the darker corners of inquisitorial conclaves, among the sealed chambers where speculation is permitted, there is a lingering question that few dare voice aloud. If the Sisters truly operate by ancient and immutable orders, then who, in the modern age, is it that they truly obey? Within the preserved accounts of the Inquisition, the participation of the Sisters of Silence in open conflict is marked not only by their brutal efficiency, but also by events that resist conventional explanation. Many of these encounters are couched in the language of sealed reports, bearing the red sigils of inquisitorial censure and restricted to only the highest levels of clearance. Where fragments surface, they hint at anomalies that even the most disciplined scribes of the Order Malleus hesitate to categorize. One such record concerns the compliance of the Yethlan subsector. Multiple inquisitors confirm that a black ship of the Sisterhood was diverted to a warzone, where an uncontrolled psychic maelstrom was destabilizing Imperial fleets. Imperial auguries suggested that the warp itself had collapsed into a self-sustaining storm, one impossible to dissipate without catastrophic losses. When the Sisters deployed, the storm subsided with unnatural speed, as though the very presence of their cadres stilled the currents of the warp itself. Mechanicus Logi engineers who studied the event noted that the energy patterns did not resemble gradual dissipation but an abrupt erasure, as if entire segments of warp turbulence had ceased to exist. The report was marked conclusive by the Ordo Hereticus, but remained sealed under orders of the High Lords of Terra, likely to suppress speculation about what limits the Sisters' null energies may truly reach. Another anomaly is recorded in relation to the defense of Raukos. In this campaign, a minor chaos incursion had overrun key manufactoria and Imperial Guard regiments were nearing collapse. Witnesses state that the Sisters moved ahead of the main line, their blades unsheathed but rarely raised, and the enemy forces broke without extended combat. Eyewitness testimonies describe heretic forces throwing down their weapons, clawing at their faces, or collapsing into seizures. Post-battle autopsies revealed extensive neural trauma in the absence of physical wounds, leading several inquisitorial medici to propose that the pariah fields had inflicted irreversible psychic backlash upon the cultists, many of whom had minor but unstable mutations. Such records were marked as anomalous, for pariah suppression typically negates psychic manifestation rather than causing lethal collapse. Not all reports speak of victories. At the Purge of Caloris, fragments of sealed dossiers describe a phenomenon whereby the Sisters' presence destabilized Imperial allies as much as enemies. Several Inquisition stormtrooper squads accompanying them were rendered combat ineffective, struck by sudden nausea, disorientation, or paralysis when operating too closely beside the null cadres. One interrogator who survived described the sensation as the marrow being pulled from my bones. This contradiction, where allies were nearly broken by the same aura that destroyed Psykers, was classified as an unpredictable anomaly. The document is incomplete, with entire sections redacted suggesting that the Inquisition either failed to explain the occurrence or chose to bury its implications. Sealed reports often describe sudden appearances and disappearances of the Sisters across campaigns. At the Black Rift of Casmond, multiple Inquisitors testified that a detachment of Silent Sisters arrived without notice, cleansed a demon incursion with no reinforcements, and then departed without requesting resupply, medical treatment, or acknowledgement. Their transports were not recorded entering or leaving the system. VoxNet archives retrieved by the Ordo Chronos revealed no trace of the vessels. The event was formally categorized as an irregularity of timestamp and warp index. Whether this suggests some hidden technology, forbidden warp manipulation, or merely gaps in record-keeping remains unknown. The pattern that emerges from these encounters is one of uncertainty wrapped in necessity. Every documented appearance of the Sisters demonstrates results of unquestionable value to the Imperium. Psychic storms stilled, demonic incursions annihilated, heretical armies broken. Yet alongside these triumphs lie unexplained phenomena, sealed dossiers, and redacted after-action reports. The Inquisition, which demands knowledge as the basis of power, tolerates these gaps only because the Sisters are indispensable. Their silence extends not only to their voices, but also to the truths they leave unspoken, written in sealed archives no one is permitted to open. Among the most tightly restricted archives within the Inquisition's vaults are the sealed files pertaining to the Sisters of Silence. Unlike the codified records of other Imperial institutions, these documents are deliberately fragmented, stored across multiple vault clusters to prevent any single archivist from possessing the full extent of their content. The files that do survive in piecemeal suggest an organization that is both indispensable and deeply mistrusted, regarded as a tool of last resort rather than a fully integrated arm of the Imperium. Classified dossiers are often devoid of explanatory detail, instead consisting of numerical logs, redacted names, and whole sections erased with cipher coding. One file, marked under the sigil of the Ordo Malleus, references a Project Null Index, a theoretical calculation of the cumulative psychic void produced by several thousand Silent Sisters concentrated in one theatre of war. The mathematical projections are incomplete, but the surviving fragments indicate potential risks of planetary destabilization, including collapse of local warp routes and systemic breakdown of astropathic communications. The file concludes with an unverified order that such concentrations must never be permitted under standard conditions, implying that the Imperium itself may be endangered by the extreme deployment of its own weapon. Another sealed archive, stored under Ordo Hereticus custody, records testimonies from Psykers taken aboard black ships. These individuals, already broken and restrained, consistently describe the Sisters as more terrifying than their chains or their captors. Some testimonies claim the sisters drain not only psychic power, but the will to resist, leaving prisoners in a state of profound despair. Inquisitorial censors redacted entire sections of these accounts, with surviving annotations labelling the claims as excessive anthropomorphizing. The decision to obscure such testimony suggests that even rumour of the sisters' effect upon Imperial Psykers must be tightly controlled, lest it spread fear within the ranks of sanctioned witchbinders and astropathic choirs. The most heavily restricted files, stamped with the double seal of the Ordo Sicarius and Ordo Kronos, concern unexplained disappearances linked to silent sister detachments. In multiple cases, entire squads are reported deployed to warzones but are absent from subsequent fleet tallies, their loss neither confirmed nor denied. Annotations describe temporal discrepancies in warp index records, alongside the possibility that the sisters operate under an authority higher than even inquisitorial mandate. The sealed conclusion reads only, "Their silence conceals more than the absence of voice." From the perspective of the Inquisition, the Sisters of Silence represent both asset and enigma. They are a bulwark against the most dangerous threats that stalk humanity: the uncontrolled psyker, the demonic incursion, the heretical warp cult. No other arm of the Imperium possesses their unique capacity to negate the immaterium at its root. Yet this strength is shadowed by a degree of unpredictability that even the Inquisition cannot fully reconcile. Their effects on allies, their unexplained vanishings, and the uncharted extremes of their nullfield capabilities leave questions unanswered, questions that remain too dangerous to pursue openly. In the final assessment, the Sisters of Silence are acknowledged as an instrument without replacement, but also one that must be kept apart. They are summoned when the alternative is ruin, then dismissed into obscurity once the danger has passed. Their loyalty is not in doubt, but the consequences of their power remain uncertain, and the Inquisition accepts this contradiction as a necessary imbalance. The archives close with a statement attributed to an anonymous inquisitor. The Imperium cannot endure without them, but it dares not look too closely at what they are.